Showtime. The title I gave for this evening was Religion with or Without Community. And what I want to do this evening is just try to set the mood of this with, it's pretty well known now that community in a lot of ways in society, in culture, in church, is diminishing, and there's reasons for it. And when I look at that, I'd just like to say after that, maybe some of the things that we're losing in our awareness of what the importance of community. Then I'd like to say something about what I think some of the values are of sharing in community, especially I want to talk about the religious community that we share. And then finally, I would like to say, well, what kind of community should it be? And how could we create a community that's especially based on the gospel message? It's no doubt that we read quite a bit about the loss of community. And we've been warned even that a lack of people knowing that they belong to something larger than themselves can have deleterious effects, even on their health. What we found, I think in recent years too, is a greater and greater distrust of institutions in general. If you just even look at some of the statistics of people's confidence in what we used to assume were leaders, for example. I mean, the approval rate of our Congress, for example, sometimes it struggles to be in double figures. You know, it's just it's like the Keystone Cops sometimes you're dealing with. Even something as solid as we always thought, well, the Supreme Court. Within the last year or two, if you notice, the level of confidence in the court and some of the court systems has also decreased quite dramatically, noticeably. Even people's confidence in religious leaders, especially after the abuse crisis that we had, all of a sudden lessened, the importance of the message even that come from religious leaders. More and more people are talking in surveys that are taken, people are lonely, depressed, anxious, unhappy, bored, demoralized, and searching for some sense of meaning. This is especially true, I'm told, with younger people now, who feel that the American dream is not going to be their dream, and they're maybe not going to be better off than what their parents were. And they specifically have a great hesitation in trusting in any kind of institutions. And that's why there's a lack of joining, especially even in church community amongst a younger generation. There's statistics to back this up. There's one statistic that I came across that really captured me. It's frightening. Last year in a survey, 17% of American people said that they did not have a friend. That's 1 out of 6 people in America. Didn't even say, I don't have friends. I don't have a friend. And you wonder then what their sense of belonging and connection is with that in life. And all of this with this distrust of institutions, even an institution like the church, is having its effect. I just read this recently also. One of the great institutions that really brought us together and gave us a sense of purpose and connection was marriage and the family. As you know, statistically now, there are fewer and fewer marriages taking place in America. Lots of younger people think that either let's just live together, or it's too much trouble trying to put effort into keeping a marriage going, or they just don't see any use for children, or they don't see a future for children. One author summed it up in this way, that there are a number of people in the country who now say that marriage is an alternative lifestyle. We used to say that about hippies or something like this, you know, an alternative lifestyle. And here we are, people looking at this, and you wonder, you know, all that, the goodness of what family life could bring, and the sharing of family, you know, in larger groups, that's all quite threatened now. And it overflows into the church. You do surveys also, and people aren't bothering with church. They find the church irrelevant, discredited. They don't like some of the teachings of the church. They're made to feel maybe like outsiders. And there's a general level of atheism also that's taking over, practical atheism. You know, I hang out with God once in a while like this. I'm not quite sure of the future of America, but as you know, Canada and Western Europe are largely de-Christianized and without any kind of faith, you know. If you get 5 to 7% of the French people to go to church somewhat regularly, that's a big number. This is the elder daughter of the church, you know, France. America, I think you can only define religious involvement by church attendance. That's only one measuring rod. But you see, it's lessening as we go along. And yet we find people still, over 80% of American people believe in some notion either of a God, a supreme being, an absolute, a universal spirit, whatever they call it. And 70-something% believe in an afterlife. And over 70% believe in the soul or some spiritual thing more than just bodiliness. And yet they can't find an outlet for that need within an organized group. That's why I'm afraid a lot of times what happens, it just gets left into individualism. I come at things individually. Now that I go back in recollection, I realized that some years ago, I came across this. I don't know if you ever heard of this book. It was written in the 1950s. I only came across it in the 60s. It was written by David Reisman, and it was called The Lonely Crowd. And Reisman was looking at what happened to society after the Second World War, and as we moved to suburbia and all of that. And he thought that people in previous times had been geared to face life with inward kinds of convictions, and you were to even school yourself in things like integrity and virtue and all, and that's how you made decisions in life. Now he thought a lot of people are making decisions only based on what someone else tells them. The media, especially at that time in the 50s, television, radio, all of that. And he worried what was happening to people instead of decisions on interior qualities. It became more of outside secular kinds of concerns. What struck me about that, if you think of the title, The Lonely Crowd, it's like clean dirt, you know, jumbo shrimp, you know, it's the lonely crowd. If you've ever been in an airport, you know, you're just an individual. It's not a community. You're an individual, elbow to elbow, trying to get on the plane. Another one I came across entering the year 2000, it was by Robert Putnam. He entitled the book, Bowling Alone. And he said people used to join, bowling groups. You were on a team and you did that. And he said he just uses that as an image to say things break down and now you see somebody in a bowling alley just by themselves, doing this by themselves, bowling alone. And for him also it was the same thing. The lack of communities in the larger society, in the community itself. And it was harming people, creating, he's writing this in the year 2000 already, saying people are more lonely, isolated, don't connect, and it's hurting them physically and also spiritually. Another book I remember reading it a long time ago. It was read by Robert Bellah, and he wrote this in 1985, Habits of the Heart. And one of the big things in that, he pointed out what has characterized the United States, especially after the Enlightenment and the founding fathers and mothers, individualism. I gotta be me first, watching out for number one. And in the Enlightenment model of this in the 1800s, on which we largely inherited here in America, it was an attempt to move away from authority figures. The divine right of kings, a church, a pope telling you what you could do, and now it was the bid for freedom, individuality, and all. But the problem with that, I find, is it leaves people isolated and only with themselves as their own guide. I've come across people, you've probably heard this a number of times. People now say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Somehow, you've heard this or not? You've heard that, yeah. It's kind of a mantra. It's like a bumper sticker now you can put on a car. And I'm spiritual. I'm looking for something in different kinds of ways, but I won't be religious. It means I won't join any kind of a group with this. And people make their own kind of choices, but I just find it so isolating. One person said, I am following the Buddhist way, and Buddha the original Buddha, left finding the interior self up to the individual. It was individual. No God was going to help you. There was no grace or nothing. It was just rugged self-effort. But even Buddha, in that, formed a monastic community. He didn't leave it up to just people to be hermits. And so even with this rugged individualism, there was a need to join the community. The other monks would give you a good example. They'd discipline you if you got out of line. They'd encourage you if you were doing something correctly. And so even within this very individualistic mode of trying to be religious, it was almost a necessary dimension that they'd find of somehow I have to be connected and joined to something more than me. And that's, I think, is what's happening in America. We are such rugged individualists that becomes very difficult to think of something in the larger domain. You think of this, Harvey Cox, for example, he was a theologian at Harvard for years. In the 1960s, he wrote a book called The Secular City. And in it, he was just trying to show that largely in the 1800s, a lot of Americans lived on farms. There were rural people. Cities weren't as big as they are. And in the 1900s, it was the cities that were just growing and larger and larger. And you could live in a 10-story apartment house now in a city and not know any neighbor in the building. And he was saying, and a lot of the cities are so independent and isolated that only the secular domain takes over. And he says, this is just the difference, that what's happening to us in this isolation. Maybe back in the 1800s, when you're on the farm, you were with your mom and dad, and they told you right and wrong, good and bad, all that kind of stuff. And if you didn't get it from them, You got it from Grandma and Grandpa, who had the same message. And if you went a little further down the road, you got it from your aunts and uncles down the road. And you got the same kind of message about virtue and honesty and integrity in the local churches. And there was this whole way of community that reinforced certain kinds of beliefs. Cox is just pointing it out. He said, I'm not making a judgment, but things have changed now as we are more isolated. You just think of any of you. I mean, I grew up in an old neighborhood, you know, and I knew everybody on the block, and everybody knew me. And I knew if I got out of line, and some of the neighbors went to my parents and said, Richie's messing up again like that, they'd believe the neighbor and not me. And what happened is you had a sense of neighborhood and community, a lot of times based even around a church and all that. Well, that more and more disappears. And now we become more isolated even in the suburbs. And I think somewhat there's a lack of caring more and more for others, because a lot of times their problems aren't seen by us because we're more isolated. So what I'm going to say that sets up kind of a mood, and it's no secret. Church attendance, church involvement, and all is diminishing. So what I'd like to say in that is there something that's lost in that, and is there something that's really worthwhile that we should get out of belonging to a community? And when I was thinking about this, I was reading different things. I summarized it in 4 points so that I will go 1, 2, 3, 4, so you know where I am. As a heading just to this, it's a reminder. By its very nature, Christianity, Catholicism, is a communal religion. From its very beginning, it's a group, it's togetherness, it's working with the whole group. We don't leave people isolated. If you don't like that, you could try being maybe a hermit somewhere. But by its nature, the church is that way. And I think when we're in that community, we sense the need even for others and the growth that can come out of belonging with others. This is just what some of the authors say, first of all, is in community, you'll know that there is a sense of belonging. And people need a sense of belonging. And in the religious community, it's a sense of belonging also to something that is greater than just me. People realize there's more to life than just food, shelter, survival, and all of this. Is there something bigger that I can find in the context of living with others and sharing with others? A second thing is in community, being together in a prayerful, even worshiping community brings out our own sense of identity. It gives us an ability to grow that we might not have if we just stayed on our own. We grow by bonding, by being with others. You know, I noticed this especially is we have Mass Sunday, and I see people, when the people come up for communion, I just almost feel it, the sense of community and belonging. They're getting up out of their seats, they're walking up there, and everybody is sharing the same meal. We give the host, and I think everybody is conscious. I'm not the only one receiving the body and blood of the Lord. I'm together, everybody, we're doing this, and it's some sense of this connection. It's something, I don't know, it's hard to put in words even, but I get this sense of it, that at that point, especially communion, we know who we are. I had a friend of mine, a priest friend who's now dead. He said one time, the church is never more of itself than when it gathers around the table. It's sort of like the family is never more than itself when it gathers around the table on Thanksgiving or Christmas or something. And this is the way we are when we gather around the table of the Eucharist. And we know in that receiving that we are a bonded group. And I think a third thing that comes out of the community, the value of community, in overcoming our own isolation, we reinforce, we revitalize our sense of values and virtues, our beliefs. And why do we do that? Because we can get reinforced by other people. People can show us our blind sides. People help us in our need. And that's why one of the things, we come together for Eucharist. We're now in a 3-year cycle, but you know almost all of the readings, like when they're coming up. You've heard them, somewhere along the line. But the beauty of that is we come together and we hear the story together. And after a while, it's our story. And we find the story of our life also in the stories that we're reading in the scriptures all the time. And what happens little by little, as narrative theologians will tell you, the more you hear the story, the more you tell the story, the more you become the story. And that's the value, I think, of being together here in types of communities, that we're not left just on our own. And that's why finally the fourth point, in community, we find a unifying purpose, a vision, and we find one of the things, I think it's really important in community, is we get together with working for the common good. If there's anything in the Catholic moral tradition, especially about justice, is we work morally for the common good, not just for ourselves, finding out what's in it for me, but what's the common good for the larger group that's out there. That's St. Paul, for example, takes up collections for the others and talks all about the others. It's a place, a community becomes a place where we belong. We feel at home. We know our story. We share with others. And it gives us this sense of confidence. I can also mention this to you. I've come across it. There's over 1,300 studies that have been done over several decades now that ask people about their level of happiness, contentment, what they've found that makes life worthwhile and all that. And almost all the time, people who have some religious sense or working with their religion or what their faith tells them turn out to be more content and more happy than people who don't have that sense. Now, I'm not saying that, join your church and all of a sudden problems will disappear and you'll be Mary Poppins and you'll be very happy and all will be good. But it is something, and why? Because when people have some sense of commitment and connection and an understanding of values, and it fosters their internal integrity, then obviously it gives them some sense of life being worthwhile, rather than just mucking around trying to get money, food, shelter, survival, which is all fine. So I'm thinking that also it's almost proven now with all these studies that belonging to some kind of a group is not just a drag, as sometimes it can be, and God knows, sometimes churches are its own problem. You've all been to bad church services, right? I mean, you've all there. They tell this story of when St. Patrick went to Ireland, and he was converting people, and he was the bishop, and he was trying to convert one tribal leader. His name was Ossian, and Ossian said he was ready to listen, and he would convert, and he brought his whole group out in the middle of a big field, and St. Patrick came on the other side with his mitre and his crozier, and they all met in the middle of this field. And Patrick walked up to him with his staff, and planted it down and started preaching the gospel to him. At one point, about 10 minutes later, all of a sudden, Ossian started getting wobbly, started getting faint, and he passed out. People rushed up to see what was wrong, and they found out that when Patrick had put down his staff, he put it through the foot of Ossian, like that. And Ossian, so they went to Ossian after this, and they said, "Why didn't you say something?" And Ossian said, "I thought it was part of the ceremony." And I felt like that at times at really bad liturgies and bad masses, that it was, like the staff through the foot. And so there are times, community can be a headache. And you remember Sartre, hell is other people and all this kind of stuff. But the good communities are worthwhile. And so what I'd like to say now is, what is the sense of community that the Christian churches, mostly out of the Catholic tradition, working with this, that it offers? If you notice in the scriptures in the early church, the community held all things in common, and they shared with anybody who had need. It's kind of an original communism there, but they shared with everybody else, and they held all things in common. That was a kind of a community that cared about the others. In the same community, everybody was equal. You see it in 1 Corinthians 11. Some people have wisdom, some people have teaching, some people speak in tongues, some people interpret the tongues, some are prophets. Each one has a gift, but all are equal. Nobody has the better gift than the other, because it is the Spirit who finally gives the reality. What kind of a community is the early community? Paul says, in the community there is neither Jew nor Gentile, man nor woman, free man nor slave, but all are one in Christ Jesus. Total equality. I'm not sure that the clergy always got that message. I think there have been times when we have had a disordered kind of a level of what the community is about, but there's always hope for the clergy. And in this, what this says, once again, is everything there the community was dealing with was for the common good, for the larger picture. It wasn't just about me and my kinds of needs. This is one of the things I find even helpful in figuring out when we talk about what sin is. A lot of times sins are my peccadillos or whatever I did, and it's an offense against God. It was in the catechism, I remember it. An offense against God. Oh, it is. But I think when you think about what sin is, we sin against other people. Our sin is against others. And that's why when people go to confession, for example, you don't just do it individually. People confess to someone else. And somebody like the priest who is confessing is a representative of the community who is also saying, in the name of the community that you have offended, through the mercy of God, I try to minister this forgiveness to you. But it's the forgiveness of God, not of the particular priest. And if you think about that, sin is largely what we do to other people, not only to God. And further than that, sin is also the sin against ourselves, because we hurt ourselves when we sin. Why? Because we get locked into a selfishness that only works on us. As the saying goes, somebody who is all wrapped up in himself makes a very small package. And this is kind of the theory, at least, of what the community is about. So when I try to say, well, what kind of a community are we looking for? The place I go to look at this is Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, 42 to 47, after that. And it gives you the characteristics of what we should be. And there's 4 characteristics. I want a lot of 4s tonight. I usually do 3s because of the Trinity. But then 4s just kept coming up. And these are the 4. Acts 2:42. The first one, whatever the community is, it is a community of prayer. I sometimes see people, when they come to Mass, they come a little early. And they're praying before Mass. So Mass starts, they're kind of ready. In the monasteries like the Cistercians and all that, they pray throughout the day, several times a day. And they're working out in the fields, or they're doing this and that, and the bell rings, and it means it's time for prayer. And they come running in like that. And then they sit quietly. It's called the statio. It's the station where they just quiet down, get calm, forget feeding the cows, just get quiet. And they do that for several minutes. Then they can start into the prayer. And that, I think, helps, especially in the Eucharist. The prayer of people is so important, not just the prayers that the priest reads out of the book, which have their own importance. And these are equal prayers. The prayer of the people and the prayer of the clergy go together. I'm not sure the clergy always got that message, but that's what it's about. The Second Vatican Council defined very clearly the importance of the laity in the Church. Nobody quite knows it, but when they were doing the documents of the Second Vatican Council on the Church, there were 8 chapters on that, and there was a fight over it with some of the bishops. Which was going to come first? Stuff about the clergy or the laity? And they argued about this thing. And they finally agreed. Laity first, and then the clergy. You can do this. Because, as Cardinal Newman said one time, the clergy without the laity would look pretty foolish, because you constitute about 99% of what the Church is about. And so I think this whole question of prayer, and they're not just gimme prayers. We think, we pray for this, that. That's a place for that. There's just prayers there that are of worship, of letting go, of connection with God in this whole Eucharistic context. A second characteristic in the Acts is what they call fellowship. I know it's a masculine word, but fellowship. And we try to encourage this, that there be connection and harmony and get together and friendliness and all this fellowship. But the word in Greek, it's interesting. The nouns in Greek that end in I, A, are kind of like a transitive. They're a movement. To really translate, koinonia is the word for fellowship. It really means fellowshipping, doing the act of making fellowship work. The Greek word diakonia means service, but it's an IA noun, and it really means servicing. It's doing the act of it, of actually participating in what fellowship is about. And I think about this at times in how important the connection with others is. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, it says, if you are offering your gifts at the altar and you remember that you are still not reconciled with your brother or sister, leave your gifts at the altar and go first and be reconciled. And that means if you come to the table and you're still in anger or hatred or whatever else, you've got to do some rethinking about what communion is to you. St. Augustine had a sign that he used to keep on his table, his dining room table, when he invited people in. And the sign said, anyone who speaks ill of his brother or sister at this table is not welcomed. And that's the same thing, I think, with Eucharist also. It's important that we deal in what they call table fellowship. We are around this table. The church is never more church than when it gathers around this table. And when you think about this also, they held all things in common and distributed to the needy. Paul takes up collections. We still at times have the dreaded second collection. But this is an essential part of what community is. And I mean, it's harmony with the brothers and sisters. That's language that Paul uses. He calls the other brothers and sisters of what the gathering is about. There's the third element, prayer, fellowship. The third element is teachings. And it's the teaching of the apostles. It's the scriptural message that they got. They knew that they needed some sense of continuity. Paul, for example, was writing letters to different churches. These letters got passed around. Church looked at them and said, yeah, this is us. This is what we believe, yeah. And that's how part of it became inspired and put into the Bible itself. The stories of Jesus and all were handed on. And that's what Paul says. I hand on to you what I have received. The paradosis in tradition. And the tradition, it's important. And we stand by orthodoxy, folks. That's correct teaching. You know, every Sunday, we read the Creed. And the Creed is a reminder that we stand for certain things. And it's not just all up for grabs. But what that tradition is, as one author said, tradition is the living faith of dead people, not the dead faith of living people. And we remember where we came from. And we knew that in the teaching of the apostles and Paul and what the church has lived with, while at the same time we're taking that message and trying to understand how does it apply to the present day and age 2,000 years later on. I've been to church. We did this where did you ever heard of dialogue homilies that people have? It's where instead of the usual sermon, people get together and they share what the scripture was about, and it's an attempt to see what the Spirit is doing in this larger group. And I think that's its own way of trying to say, Scripture not only tells us what did it say when it was written back there, but what does it say as we live with it right now. And the final teaching in Acts 2, it's prayer, fellowship, the teaching of the apostles, and it's the breaking of the bread. They knew when to be a community, they had to come together and share the meal. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, there is one loaf, it is broken for many. The one loaf is again a sign of all the unity, and then it's broken up and shared. And there is a community dimension to it. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but priest is up here. You ever notice at the Lamb of God, he breaks the host into two pieces? You've seen that, yeah, okay. He does this, and then takes a little piece off the edge and drops it into the cup. As best I can tell what that is, in the early church, when there were no cars or anything, people couldn't get there, or somebody was sick or something, people would bring Eucharist that they had celebrated on Sunday to somebody who couldn't be there, and they had regular bread, and it might have gotten really hard or working on stale. So when they got there, they would dip it into the wine, and now the person could receive the bread that was more chewable and manageable. But still dropping that little piece in, it's always a reminder that even the Eucharist is a community for those who are sick, who can't be there, in this sharing of the larger community. Where does that leave us? Well, the sense of community, I painted a rather dramatic picture in the beginning about, institutions are in decline and people aren't joining the way they used to and all that. And I don't know quite where this is all going. Almost every diocese that I'm looking at now has gone through this: close this parish, amalgamate that parish, put these three together over here, send Father over there, and now we've got some of these priests, they're running down around taking care of 2 and 3 parishes, which is not healthy, and it doesn't really help them to really get to know all the people that they want, because now they're so spread out. And I don't know, part of this is there's diminished numbers still going to church, but a big problem with it is they're just running out of priests. And the communities may be getting smaller because a lot of times the communities are older people. A lot of the churches, you see people, there's more gray hair and white hair than there is, young people. I don't know. Karl Rahner, the great German theologian, said one time he thought he was based mostly on the European model, which was declining rather rapidly. And he talked about there might be a diaspora church. There'd just be little groups in the diaspora here and there. And the larger society, that secular society, wasn't going to be very supportive of them or help them at all. And if you wanted to still be a Catholic believer, you're going to have to really work at it and find your kind of groups. But he was saying it's going to be much smaller and smaller than it was before. Well, I'm not sure. I don't know. But as part of my catharsis, I'll tell you this. For about the last 40 years, I have been asking and wondering and preaching and praying and all of this kind of stuff. What is the plan for the future of who's going to give Eucharist to the people? What's the plan if we're running out of priests and they're all getting older and fewer and all that kind of stuff, that's not a plan. And if you just keep talking about, pray for vocations, I don't see that coming on the horizon. My archdiocese, where I come from, it's a large archdiocese. You know how many priests they are ordained in May? 1. You know how many they're going to ordain next year? 1. Year before they did something like 4. You do that around here. They're doing 2s and 3s and 4s and all that. Then you look at how many of the priests retire or die and all this stuff. And I'm looking at this thing, and my big problem is, who's going to give Eucharist? How are we going to celebrate Eucharist? Back in the 1800s, a lot of the Irish who came to this country went down south. They came from Ireland, had strong faith and all this. They went down south. There were hardly any priests down there. You can find it in the archives. They wrote letters to the bishops of Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, said, please send us priests. We want the Eucharist down here. There weren't enough priests, or they weren't going, or something like that. They didn't get the priests. So what happened? People went elsewhere. And now you get Sullivans and Murphys and Learys and all of that who are hard-shell Baptists. Okay, God bless them and all that. But what happened is they made everything of the Eucharist depend on the clergy. And that's okay if you got enough clergy. But we're running out of them. You all know this. And you know the consolidations that we're doing at it. And so this is a little way of trying to keep the thing floating. But the only thing I can see out of it, it's going to float things maybe for another 10 years, 15 years. And what are you going to do when Father Charlie is holding down 3 parishes and then he gets his heart attack and he's gone? Who replaces him? So this is I've only been dealing with this for 40 years, so just bear with me, okay? I'm not angry, I'm not upset. And what kills me about it is any corporation, any business that had this manpower problem would have solved it 30 years ago, would have had a plan, something down this. So I don't care really about whatever. What I'm wondering is what's going to happen and how do we plan for this? If there's anything that unites us, Father Rolheiser said at one time, of all the things that the church has done wrong, we've done one thing well. We've taken the words of Jesus who said, do this in remembrance of me. And we've been doing it, and that's what gathers us at this Eucharist. And when I think about it, that we're just going to lose people because we don't have somebody who can say the words, it frightens me. So here's the part that I'm not supposed to say, okay? Yeah. I've come across some people who have just decided that in the absence of something like this, they're going to do Eucharist on their own. And it may, early Eucharist, early part of the churches, there were no churches, there were no basilicas and all this. They just met in people's homes. And I don't know if that's what we're going to come back to and do this. And oh, by the way, one of the homes they met at was in the Acts of the Apostles. It says they met at Lydia's home, who was a woman who had some money. And at the Eucharist, what they used to do, they had a meal together, and then at the end of the meal, they'd bring out the special bread and wine and remember the Last Supper of Jesus. And whoever's house it was usually presided over that. Well, I'm not supposed to say about that, but Lydia may have been a presider. So this is what I wonder about, what you folks think about your Eucharist and what's going to be handed on to your kids and grandchildren and all of that. what kind of pressure would you think about trying to tell the hierarchy or take surveys or do this and say, we want the Eucharist. Now, what are we going to do about it? We want that community. We want to still be together around the table. What's happening about it? I don't know. I just I don't have an answer for this. I mean, people tell me, you clergy have all power. I ain't got any power, okay? Nobody ever asked me, okay, what's going on? I most of the time don't even know the bishop's name, He doesn't bother me. I don't bother him, okay? It's, and they have a hard job. It's hard, and a lot of them, they don't have the power because they're listening to somebody over in Rome, giving them insights. But I'd just like you to, maybe a leaving thing is, what do you think about it? What would you be willing to do, and how important is it to keep the Eucharist going? Because I don't see it in good shape right now. And as I look down the road, I don't see a plan. So that's kind of a depressing note to leave you on. But it's the reality, isn't it? I mean, you've all thought about it. You've all seen this kind of an issue. And you'd say, who's making the decisions? Who's got the plan? And there are alternatives. You could look about what the other possibilities are with this. But anyway, 40 years of talking about this, wondering if I could see it coming. I could see it coming. The year I got ordained, and I was I was helping in Queens, or the year I got ordained, there were so many priests in the Brooklyn Diocese who were ahead of me, that if I were a priest in the Brooklyn Diocese at the time when I got ordained, I would have been mathematically eliminated for ever becoming a pastor, because there were that many ahead of me, like that kind of stuff. Now, if you're 3 years out and you got a pulse, they're putting you in a parish somewhere like this to take care of things. But I'd like you folks to think that this is also your responsibility. It's your Eucharist. It's your community. And to see what you think about it and how you would raise your voice about it. The 40 years of therapy that I've been in to get over this have been very helpful, and it's really good. And I don't worry about it too much anymore. And I just want to leave you on an up note, and it is, I discovered the night prayer of Pope John XXIII. You remember good Pope John? He got the Second Vatican Council going, just roly-poly and lovey. And you imagine, the burdens on that poor man's shoulders of started the council, some wanted it, some didn't. And I was like, do you know what his night prayer was? Lord, it's your church. I'm going to bed. And that's enough, folks. Time to go home. Always know where the big hand is. Always know where the big hand is. Okay, guys. Okay. Don't report me. It's all factual. It's